Gadifer de la Salle and Jean de Bethencourt, knights born in the Kingdom of France, have undertaken this voyage to honor God and for maintenance and increasement of our holy faith, to parts of the south, to certain islands that are on the other side thereof, which they call Islands of Canaria, inhabited by infidel people with different laws and different languages, with the intention of turning them and attracting them to our faith. This is why this book is called The Canarian. And we, Brother Pierre Bontier, monk of the Saint Jean de Man, and Jean Leverrier, priest and chaplains and servants of the knights named above, have begun to write down all the things that happened to them from the beginning and the whole form of their government, of which we could have had true knowledge since they left the Kingdom of France, until Bethencourt arrived here at the islands, and thereafter came the writing in their hands, that will resume it with all the truth until the end of their conquest. Le Canarian. Dost thou turn to Jesus Christ and confess him as thy Lord and Savior? The priest mouthed languidly into the sultry island breeze of Lanzarote, his hand resting on the dirty blonde locks of a bowing Canarian tribesman. Perhaps he would be somewhat annoyed by the savage's shuddering muteness were he not but the last in a long procession of villagers, compelled into the rite of baptism, and with the same face of muffled confusion he had become so equally accustomed to and scornful of. Yet this time, and with the rising of the dazed islander upon the utterance of the rite's last words, and its completion, Jean Leverrier, priest of the Canarian expedition, was relieved. The affair had come to an end. The loud and revelrous soldiery cast their voices far into the night, as the clamor and clangor of Frankish songs traveled across the dry barrens of once wild Lanzarote, now cleaved from the fold of farthest Barbary by the righteous sword of Baron Jean de Bethencourt, the brave and the wise captain. So sang the rowdy band of knights and levied men of Fort Rubicon, plucked from their Norman homesteads and wild Gascon marshes, and cast afield into the distant horizon, lulled by stories of great riches and wild lands, ripe either for plunder or placation to the cross. Others there were who, in being less inclined or jaded to such flights of fancy, accepted the coin handed to them with no discrimination as to the final destination of souls which in battle they would evict from their respective corporeal forms. It was this blend of hope, greed, and indifference that had led to many a conquest satisfying completion, and had certainly played a part in their expedition's success on this northernmost of the islands. And it was certainly a similar amalgam that inspired the Baron de Bethencourt to sell his home in Paris and mortgage the family estate to finance an expedition that would bring him fame and riches. This was, however, impossible without a mighty patron who was to be found in the personage of King Henry III of Castile. The king, a sickly man by nature, was subject always to a keen awareness of his own mortality and haunted by the thoughts of lasting legacy which naturally proceed thereof. It was easy then for Bethencourt to sway him with stories of a rich and exotic archipelago, where rare dyes and spices sprouted from the earth as abundantly as grass, and where a savage population of pagan barbarians dwelled, waiting to be chained, christened, or quartered by the first God-fearing king daring enough to lay claim. Such proposals were regularly accepted by the kings of Iberia, whose zeal and love of conquest was known across Europe. And so Bethencourt, being instantly granted the title Lord of the Canary Islands, departed from Cadiz on ship as a leader of Spanish men and vassal to Castile. Quite the lord indeed, the priest thought bitterly, looking from his tent upon the resting soldiery in their camp. Leaving thine own fief in the hands of a Poitevin fool and that debauched brigand. These men may dance at fire and sing in jubilation, but surely no aid shall return from the king in good time that will hinder the second mutiny brewing. He was correct in part, as the two men left in command after Bethencourt's departure for reinforcements, Gadifer de la Salle and Bertin de Berneval, were soon at each other's throats. Gadifer, the old wartime friend of Bethencourt, was named governor of Lanzarote and senior among the two remaining commanders, and in his chivalrous loyalty to his liege, refused the demands of Bertin, the man tasked with stewardship of the newly built Fort Rubicon as its commander, whose licentious and avaricious behavior and rhetoric had gained him the support of the men, but with a few exceptions, in demanding that further conquests be abandoned in favor of selling the subjugated natives as slaves in the Moorish bazaars on the coast. This was of course recognized by Gadifer as open threat of mutiny, yet there was little he could do save placate the men with song and drink. Though most of the native villages had surrendered peacefully, many had been taken as slaves in battle, and the dissent among the conquistadors led the Canarians to question the permanence of their new overlords. This all was made worse by the presence of two baptized Canarians named Alfonso and Isabel, who had served as their translators ever since their arrival on the island. Bethencourt acquired them in Castile, where they had been brought some 10 years earlier as slaves by Don Almonaster, whose raids on the islands had inspired the Norman knight to launch his own expedition. Being the only members of the crew capable of communicating with the locals and harboring no love for people who abducted and forcibly converted them, they represented in the eyes of Verrier a uniquely powerful threat, and one which, to his own vexation, remained equal parts disregarded and unaddressed by Gadifer. The priest observed the pair, who sat together but a stone's throw away from the joyous men at the bonfire. Spanish garbs hung gawkily from their stiff bodies, which in their youth and liberty would have been wholly bare, save for a crude covering of animal felts and seashell ornaments. The attempt at perceived civility was made more laughable by the still visible tribal tattoos peeking out furtively from under the seams of their clothes. Yet one could not stand before them jokingly for long, when the piercing blue of their eyes was cast down upon you from their towering frames as braziers hanging from a cathedral ceiling. Their hair was most often an ashy blonde, and so it was on Alfonso, though with Isabel it appeared just as gilded as the regal mane of some Danish king, and as mesmerizingly weaved as the braided head of a forest nymph. Yes, it was enchanting, though Verrier would scarcely allow such thoughts to emerge. He was after all a man of God, and evaded the entertainment of his wanton desires skillfully, choking them out in a smoke of judgment and ill-omened fear. Will thou please be seated now, friend? Hardly can revolts be quelled by straining one's eyes at young maids. A soft yet boisterous voice spoke satirically from the back of the tent. Brother Pierre Bontier was sat at a small table, his papers and quill illuminated by a nearly melted candle, and though engrossed in his writings, a faint smirk was visible on his naturally doleful face. The friar was not an old man, though years of fasting and scholarly labor had rendered him an elder in the eyes of most, with a dried and weathered likeness rarely seen among Western monks, and bearing more resemblance to that of an early desert ascetic or some faith-beaten dervish among the infidels. He was brought as Verrier's partner, having been mesmerized by Bethencourt's stories of an undiscovered land and people ready to accept the cross. For most of the journey, he had served as a chronicler, documenting the local people with great care, and perhaps developing some undesirable sympathies along the way. Observant thou art as always, Bontier, yet only with mine own infirmities. Mayhaps thou should lift thine eyes from books and look out at the looming threats that surround us. The priest replied, and though beginning with a flustered bark, ended in his usual calm and cold tone, more fitting when addressing a man he had come to see as a dear friend. The Guanches are no threat, Verrier. I fear thou art the one who loometh over them. And fret not, I tell thee, those two belongeth not to Lanzarote. They were taken from Tenerife, whose king, or men say, harbors naught but ill will for the men of this isle we now hold, who return that sentiment gladly. Guanachinet. The friar was the only one Verrier knew who could use such a term. Most would simply call them barbarians or savages. Some attempting eloquency would say Canarians. Verrier and some of the captains might say Guanche in somewhat crude attempt to impress the native chiefs in conversation, but only Bantier called them by their own name. Or one of them at least. It was only the men of Tenerife who used that term, while each island had its own tribe. Lanzarote was home to the Majos tribe, who, though speaking the same language, viewed the Guanachinet of Tenerife, the largest and most advanced tribe, as power-hungry brutes and villains. Governor Gadifer leaves Rubicon for the hills by the morrow. He intendeth to parley with the local king Guadarfia, as to gauge if perchance he would lend aid to our cause. Yet Berthine seemeth to take no action, save for sending a party of men into the cave system, in search of runaway slaves. Verrier spoke seated on his makeshift bed, staring at the dirt beneath concernedly. I fear thy work has been in vain, friend. Something is afoot, and those blue-eyed devils rally in their caves, waiting to pour out from the darkest abyss and take us at our weakest. For the first time, Bantier paused his writing and looked over slowly at Verrier. The two men shared a concerned glance, at which point Bantier picked up the candlestick and, laying himself onto the straw heap he called a bed, slowly uttered, "Do not call demons those who hide in the dark from blood and fire, but look upon those who dance about it in front of thy nose, friend." The friar blew out the candle and said not a word more. The dawn was broken by a tumult of flustered guards, who frantically burst into the tent, searching for their two dozing clergymen. "Father," the head guardsman spoke in an urgent tone, "the party have returned from their mission. They ask both of thee and the friar to meet with them in the cave. It seems to be something of great import, though I lack any further knowledge in detail." Verrier quickly rose from the floor, woke the loudly slumbering Bantier with a rough nudge, and hastened alongside a small escort into the nearby hills. As they trekked, he began observing the now all too familiar Canarian landscape, a mixture of broad desert valleys, enclosed on all sides by rocky green hills, and great black stone beaches, which crept slowly inland like hungry wolves circling an oblivious flock. The question of how the Guanches had managed to survive in such an unforgiving land for untold generations was certainly present in his mind, but was given little nurture as more pressing matters carried him away. It would certainly not be beyond Berthine to allow these two men, known supporters of the governor, to disappear forever in some flint-laden chasm under the watchful eyes of his partisans. Though knowing him, he would just as likely clamp them in irons and sell them off to some Granadan merchant or another. His concerns were made no less grave upon sighting the cave's entrance. The dry plateau dropped into a gaping stone maw in the earth, flanked by a pair of armed soldiers on both ends. One quickly greeted them, and having lit up a torch, led them into the depths. Despite its wide opening, the cave quickly narrowed into a tunnel with a high and curved ceiling. They walked along a surprisingly neat path, which rose only slightly above a deathly still body of crystal clear water. As far as the torchlight was thrown, it revealed a mesmerizing illusion, with all that hung above their heads lying below, and the faintly glimmering quartz now strewn across a long and mirrored false night sky. The man who led them was first to break the heavy silence. "We tracked down 3 runaway slaves here, caught them whilst they were still only at the entrance. The problem arose when the wild interpreter of yours ran into the cave all on her own, hence we pursued her into the main chamber ahead." Bantier's eyes widened with unease. "I certainly hope "Ye have not brought upon her molestation of any sort," he said with as harsh a tone as his slight nature might allow. "Ha! Well, surely we had every right to do so," the soldier said with a snigger. "The savage wench had all but asked for it. Alas, thou may be at ease, monk. Our commander ordered she be left unharmed, and set her to explaining the things ye have been brought here to inspect in her defiance." The long path and its adjacent water body came to an abrupt end as the tunnel was cut off by a sheer stone wall. Yet to both clerics' great bewilderment, a large, astonishingly precise entrance was carved into the living rock to their right, with the water of the lake just barely below it. The posse carefully stepped off the path, through the rectangular entry, and into a long and dark hallway of precisely cut, smooth edges. The farther they went, the more frequent and elaborate were becoming the spiral carvings that now covered the walls. They were broken only by the odd series of glyphs, all of which Bontier tried desperately to write down in the dim and ever-moving light. Soon the glyphs and spirals were replaced with more intricate carvings. Great galleys crossed the sea in a fleet, their elegantly curved hulls teeming with passengers. Many small rafts surrounded them, the people huddled together. Surely this was depicting a great journey of some kind, yet such a voyage could hardly have been undertaken by the primitive Canarians, whose fear of the sea Verrier had noted early on. Yet they must have ferried themselves over from the mainland once in the past, and despite their humble lifestyles and stone-based tools, the Guanches did seem to possess a certain natural brightness, and a wizened gaze was oddly common in their blue-gray eyes. Bontier had once, while reading to him the natural history of Pliny, noted the account of King Juba II of Mauritania, and his expedition to the islands well over a millennia before their own petty congregation set foot on Lanzarote. In it he describes the islands as covered with ancient structures, the ruins of which were wholly uninhabited. In those times they were known as the Fortunate Islands, and represented the mysterious western edge of the known world. In that regard little had changed, yet the structures described by Juba were mostly gone, save for their stone foundations which scarcely broke out from beneath the earth and brush. Ahead of them could now be heard the voices of aggravated soldiers, and a light was cast into the passage from a distant room. "Silence, all of ye!" a shrill and nasal voice echoed down the hall. "Your brutality is of no use. Speak now, Isabel. What is it you hold?" As they finally stepped into the room, both clergymen were at a loss for words. A vast conical room rose high above, reaching a series of openings through which light shone down onto a multitude of wrapped human remains, elevated on wooden planks and stone slabs. The carvings and glyphs were now even more elaborate and mystifying, with many idols, offerings, and pieces of pottery covering the chamber floor. Isabel sat hunched over with her back turned to them, cradling something in her arms. Next to her was a particularly large human body, which laid on a slab of volcanic rock. All of the mummies were large in truth, larger even than any of the living Guanches they had met so far, who themselves towered over the Europeans. Surrounding her was a party of Berthin's men, who seemed to have been put under the authority of one Jean-Ariette Prudhomme, Bethencourt's counselor. "What is the meaning of this? Can thou not see she is frightened?" Bontier upbraided Prudhomme while pushing through the men. He sat next to the shaking woman, and whispered a set of words in the sharp and glottal tongue that only he had truly managed to learn from her. She looked at him with wide and watery eyes, and handed to him a wrapped idol. "Achoron," she mouthed slowly. An idol of the sky god, Bontier thought. It was well known to him that a relatively similar name was used on all of the islands when referring to the Guanches' principal creator deity, and that a woman would never dare touch his idol were she not herself one of his priestesses, or mahuadas. He had hoped Isabel's conversion to Christ to be sincere, and that her years in Spain would help erase the idolatrous ways of her people. He spent many nights with her and Alfonso, instructing them on the statutes of God, and learning from them the language and legends of Canaria. All was for naught. She trusted me not. She believed not. His thoughts were crushed by the overwhelming weight of his failure, and his heart skewered by betrayal. What has she told thee, Brother Bontier? Prudhomme spoke while grabbing the monk by his shoulder. The friar was silent, the relic clutched tightly in his hands. The woman seemed quite fond of it. But her savage nature is after all inborn. Prudhomme's arrogant voice was cast down, with all the sharpness and cruelty innate in a man whose tongue is his weapon of choice. But thine own cradling of it bemuses me. Thou art a man of the cloth, Bontier. Why mock thine order? Bring no further shame on St. Francis's legacy, and hand me the idol. Verrier, who had up until this point been only a silent spectator, grabbed the counselor by the arm, lifting it off of his accosted friend. By what right dost thou speak of him in such a manner? This man hath uncovered this island for us, guided us through negotiations all. It is thee who is shamed by placing thine own hand on a brother of the cloth. Prudhomme was poised to remind the priest of his perilous position, yet the opportunity to do so evaded him. No sooner had Verrier concluded his speech than Bontier lifted himself off of the ground and smashed the idol forcefully. His desperate sigh was met with Isabel's maddened roar as she lunged at the bewildered friar. "Curse ye Tibicenas! Black dogs!" She growled through her teeth, her hands on the meek friar's neck. "How could thee, monk? We trusted thee, and thou desecrated the idol of our Abora, our creator." "It is Jesus Christ who is thy creator, Isabel," the monk gasped for air. "It is thou who lied, who confessed falsely. Repent." Two soldiers grabbed the wrathful Amazonian, lifting her off of the choking Bontier. As the monk was lifted himself, the cloth-covered mummy was pushed off of its slab, revealing a strand of flaming red hair just barely slipping out from the back of its covered scalp. "Cut it open," Prudhomme commanded. "Let us see what else this wild bitch has been hiding from us." Isabel's screams were muffled by a soldier's hand while the mummy was being hastily cut open. The dried remains of a man, roughly 6 French pieds, or 2 meters in length, his face perfectly preserved, like the head of some great martyr, was topped by a full mane of braided red hair. His body was covered in painted symbols, some recognized by Verrier to be the written glyphs from the tunnel. "Ye desecrated our Chayo! The revered ancestors will take vengeance upon thee," she cried out desperately. "Isabel, what are these symbols? Read them to us." Bontier spoke to her, yet his eyes were fixed on the painted cadaver. "It is not too late for thee. Help us repent, and thine offenses shall be forgiven." "What do we care for the lines in some barbarian's bones?" Prudhomme spoke laughingly. "Break the vases, men, and let us torch this pagan temple. Berthine will be made aware of what transpired, and I certainly shall not vouch for the pardon thou hast promised her. Let her transgressions be judged by the Lord." Verrier spoke, shocked by his own attempt at gallantry, which he told himself was simply a priest fulfilling his duty. "But if thou hath any harm in mind for her, let it be taken out on myself. For had Simon Peter himself not denied the Lord, yet was lifted up first among his apostles?" Prudhomme gave him a queer look, unsure of what he had just borne witness to. "Truly I care not for thy sudden zealous outburst, father, nor have I any claim on her soul. Do with her what thee will. The cave will be searched and subsequently torched, and should that not prove ample time for thine little investigation, then perhaps it is God's judgment on all of you." The soldiers quickly began breaking the vases, yet finding only dried bones and strange charms. Isabel broke down crying. "Why dost thou care, priest? Why do any of ye foreign brutes care for my people's faith?" Isabel spoke out in her desperation. "That mad monk interrogated me for months, learned our language. and yet he smote our most sacred idol without a second thought. It is these foreign brutes who will bring an end to that pagan faith, Isabel, Verrier said softly. All of thy temples will be burned and pillaged sooner or later. We wish only to preserve it so that not all knowledge will be lost. You know this to be true. He was not sure if he truly did wish to preserve it, nor if he cared for the Guanches at all. He certainly hadn't felt any particular affection toward the 100 or so he baptized so far. Yet there was something to the sorrowful wild woman, something he would never admit to for fear of himself, that pushed away all of his judgment and condescension, leaving only a desire to ward off all harm. I cannot read it, she finally spoke out in a somber tone. No one has for many ages. The people of Titeroigatra, or Lanzarote as thou call it, have long abandoned their kinship to mine own. Their knowledge of the glyphs is not known to me, yet I doubt they possess much, if any. But the writing is so abundant, and these tombs so revered, how could thy knowledge of it fade? What of the ships painted on the walls? Art thou hiding something still? Bontier asked, once again calmly. I hide nothing. None have read nor written on the islands in countless generations. The ships thou saw were from the times of the coming. She spoke ever more quietly. Once our people were wealthy, ruled many lands. We honor the sky god, but also the sun god, the divine spirit of the world, Guayaherai, and his mother, Chirihorahi. But this angered the black dog, Guyota, king of demons, who was offered no sacrifice. In revenge, Guyota trapped Magik, the sun god, in a mountain. The sky god Achoron wept for Magik. So the seas rose and swallowed our home. We followed the great rivers inland. There we lived for many generations, but the wrath of the gods could not be escaped. The black dog drank the great rivers, and the green lands became a vast desert. Many fled east with the king, she continued, in search of a new river to settle. Some remained in the desert as wanderers. But our people prayed to the great Achoron. We offered the sky our minds, hearts, and bodies in return for a new land to call our own. The god descended upon us and told us to travel west, beyond the Atlas, the land of our origin. When we arrived at the sea, we were attacked by the demon Guyota, whom Achaman was waiting for. He beat Guyota and freed the sun from its prison. The demon was thrown into the sea, where our home had once been. A great mountain rose from the sea to be its prison, and around it 6 other islands. The first is Tenerife, my old home. How did ye sail to them? Thy people's fear of the sea is known to all, said Verrier. We do not fear the sea, priest. Our ancestors were great sailors, but we've rejected their legacy to settle these isles, continued the woman. When Ahaman granted us ships, we vowed to protect these islands and keep the demon Guyota asleep through offerings. We had no need for writing that which some shamans already knew, nor for ships to conquer other lands. The woman had barely finished speaking when a sharp and ear-piercing whistle flew out from her mouth. The 2 men looked at each other, hoping that one was perhaps not surprised by the sudden action. Why dost thou not tell me this earlier, Isabel? The monk said ecstatically. So many nights we've spent speaking of matters so petty next to what you've told us now. These stories could help us bring thy people closer to Christ, help them to understand. The idol is broken. All matters are concluded on my part. Thou may ask me anything now. It changes little. Isabel mouthed absent-mindedly. A faint light was seen, followed by a soldier racing frantically into the chamber. Master Prudhomme, your presence is required at Fort Rubicon. The Canarians have attacked the camp. The soldier yelled out with a salute. Their first assault was unsuccessful, but all men are required to return to the garrison. Prudhomme, who had already grown weary from the lack of valuables in the tomb, had now fallen into a rage. "Very well, alert Commander Berthine to our return. Come on now, men. That's been enough of that. Damned savages," he said with a slight wave. "Master Prudhomme, the commander is gone. He left with most of the ships. I fear we've been abandoned." The soldier sweated with each word. "He was on an expedition with Governor Gadifer, who has returned with only one half-manned ship." The enraged Prudhomme hastened the men out from the cave, as a great quake shook the very foundations they stood on. The lake of crystal water rippled and splashed, while the tunnel seemed poised to collapse in on them. What was that?" Verrier whimpered. Isabel laughed. "The demon god kicks in his sleep. We should falter not because of it." The tremor was followed by a medley of eerie whistling, which faded away as the group exited the cavern. "Be at guard, men. We make haste for Rubicon. Hopefully the governor will be willing to let us back in, if he doesn't have our heads for—" Prudhomme's words were cut short by a large rock, flung elegantly and at high speed into the soft of his temple. The pandemonium of flying spears and swinging polearms ensued, many conquistadors falling, with many more Guanches fleeing back into their hills. The two frightened clerics who had been hiding behind a nearby rock formation were called back by the exhausted voices of their narrowly victorious comrades. Prudhomme was dead on the sand, along with many of his party. Bontier, who quickly mouthed a prayer above the bodies of fallen men, Christian and pagan both, departed solemnly with the remaining soldiers. Verrier followed, yet couldn't help but turn his head and gaze up at the Guanches retreating into the hills. And the tall, blonde woman who had covered herself in animal felts in place of the Spanish gown that lay torn in the sand below Verrier. Her blue eyes gleamed at him in the high sunlight as she turned away to meet a warrior with a spear, a cross pendant shining from his neck. Two years had passed in constant struggle against the forces of Guadarfia, the Guanche king of Lanzarote. The conquistador ranks, fallen to treachery and starvation, were forced to make a last stand against the fierce native warriors. It was only with the return of Lord Bethencourt, who had been gathering his forces across Spain, that fortune turned in Christian favor. The Guanches were crushed by the new Castilian reinforcements, and their king captured. The natives were rounded up for baptism. The king Guadarfia plunged into a pool of cool rainwater by the hand of Jean Le Verrier, emerged as Louis, a humble Catholic farmer. There were few afterwards willing to resist conversion. The island of Lanzarote, with Bethencourt as its lord and governor, was a now fully incorporated province of the Castilian crown. Yet the name of the monarch in Toledo was both distant and meaningless to the Canarians, who in their broken hearts and fear recognized only Bethencourt as their cruel conqueror king. Bethencourt, aided by his loyal knight Gadifer, went on to subjugate the isles of El Hierro and Fuerteventura, where they founded the city of Betancuria in honor of their valiant leader. Their victories were brought to an end only by their loss in the Battle of Arguinguin during the failed conquest of Gran Canaria. They were welcomed back in Spain with a fanfare of trumpets, bugles, and other musical instruments. But with a new flare-up of the 100 Years' War breaking out in his native Normandy, Bethencourt decided to return to his beleaguered homeland. This not before being granted the honorary title King of the Canaries by Henry III of Castile as a sign of respect. The lack of honors granted to him and Bethencourt's withdrawal from the islands greatly angered Gadifer, who rightfully viewed himself as being crucial to the conquests. The ensuing power struggle led to Gadifer issuing a quickly refused appeal to redress, sent to the court of Castile. In the end, both men returned to their respective fiefs in France, the islands left under the nominal control of Bethencourt's cousin MacLeod, who moved there with most of his offspring. Father Jean Leverrier and brother Pierre Bontier would remain on the islands, tending to the newly converted populace. Bontier founded a monastery on Lanzarote, where he would be officiated, dedicating his life to being a spiritual teacher to the Guanches, who greatly respected him. Verrier was installed as vicar of Fuerteventura in the newly constructed chapel of Our Lady of Bethencourt. Their combined testimony and writings form the chronicle of the expedition known as La Canarienne. It is regarded as one of the primary sources on the culture and language of the Guanche people. The events described therein serving as an inspiration for future explorers. The expedition of Bethencourt was perhaps the first major conquest of the Age of Exploration, which by signaling its beginning would change the world forever. It would be almost a century until the Canary Islands were fully conquered by the Spanish crown, and their people's resistance quelled. The Inquisition, aided by thousands of Spanish colonists, would slowly wipe out most of the Guanche people's traditions, as well as their language, which slowly faded away into the 17th century. In spite of their detailed documentation at the hands of European explorers, the Guanche people themselves remain mysterious and enigmatic, with many questions as to their origins remaining unanswered. Despite being described as intelligent and beautiful, they seem to remain a perpetual Stone Age society, fearful of the sea, though they had once been described as expert navigators, and despite having once possessed a form of writing, it had gone out of use by the time of the European arrival. Modern genetic testing has proven them to be a kind of relict population, maintaining an almost unchanged gene pool to that of the oldest North African farmers and hunter-gatherers who inhabited the Sahara during its green period 12 or 11,000 years ago, when it was an endless grassland of vast lakes and rivers. This same population of Caucasoid morphology and carrying genes for pale skin and reddish hair seem to represent an ancestral population that formed the basis of early Egyptian and Berber societies. These traits can still be found among isolated Berber communities in the High Atlas, as well as among Egyptian royal mummies. Mummification itself played a key role in Guanche society, sharing nearly identical rituals to that of the Egyptians, as well as a cognate word, hayo. Yet the Guanches remained isolated, on islands they should not have had access to by any human logic. Today, the Canary Islands are an autonomous region of Spain, with a dialect of Spanish containing some Guanche words as its official language. And Spanish colonists from the Canaries contributed majorly to the modern population of Spanish New World countries, such as Cuba and Mexico, where they fled from abject poverty and constant piratical Muslim raids. Modern Canarians themselves have inherited a number of traits from their Guanche forefathers, including a multitude of words, traditions, roughly 60% of their genetic makeup, and a mysterious whistling language that can be heard traveling from the deserts of Lanzarote to the shores of Tenerife, where the demon god slumbers under Mount Teide.